Hello and welcome to another edition of Another Book Review. This week I'll be reviewing The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. I'll talk very briefly about the author, go into a spoiler-free overview of the plot, talk about what the book is about, talk about what I liked about it, what I didn't like about it, who I'd recommend the book to, and finish off with what I'll be reading for next time. I've reviewed Michael Chabon in the past. I'll leave a link below to Summerland if you want to check that review out after this. Michael Chabon's been writing for about 30 years now. His last book is probably Telegraph Avenue, I think was his last novel that came out a few years ago. This book, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay, won a Pulitzer, I believe, in the year 2000 or 2001 when it was released. Um, and he's known for this book and known for Yiddish Policeman's Union, which has a lot of similarities in the two books. Some of the themes thematically of being Jewish American and feeling separation between American culture and the traditional Jewish culture, and always kind of having a separation between those two things is a theme that kind of runs throughout this and that book. But um, that's primarily what he's kind of known for. And yeah, this is no different. This book is, it's kind of hard to summarize without spoiling. So I guess just to give broad overviews of what the book is, as you can see, it's quite long. It's about two cousins, the titular Cavalier and Clay, and one of them is from Czechoslovakia, sorry, the Czech Republic, and from Prague. And this is set in the beginning of the book is set in the late 1930s, so before the United States has entered World War II, but while Hitler is uh, invading European countries, and Joseph is the name of this character, and he escapes from Prague before the invasion. And so he's trained as an artist and as an escape artist and musician, and he comes to the United States. He comes to New York, and his cousin, who is Sammy Clayman, and the two of them, create a comic book character called the Escapist. Uh, Clay works for a novelty company that sells like whoopee cushions and things like that, and they are able to convince Sammy's boss to get into the comic book business. And this is kind of at the dawn of the superhero craze, and the character is very successful, and that causes some consternation between the artists, Cavalier and Clay, who are the creators of this comic book, and the company that prints and publishes the comic book. You have early things like media rights, which are not something that people, I think, these two guys were not thinking about when they signed, the rights to publish the novel or publish the comic book. Though there's media rights and television rights and things like that that happen later, and that's part of the story, is that about them feeling ripped off and cheated by this guy. Anapool, I think, is the publisher. Um, excuse me, and that's just one of like many subplots about the book. The book is their lives before the war, during the war, and after the war, and to put it into broad strokes. And there's a subplot of Joseph trying to get his brother specifically out of the Czech Republic, because increasingly the Jewish people of Czech Republic are becoming more and more in danger. And so there's that. There's him dealing with the anger of the complacency of the United States during this time. This is again before Pearl Harbor. Most of the book is set before Pearl Harbor, and them kind of feeling like fish out of water because they're Jewish Americans who've created this character as part of this genre that people just in general, especially at this time, just do not respect his art. And Michael Chabon has like a beautifully written passage in the book defending art in general and escapism in particular. That's like one of the highlights of the book. Um, but that's one of the subplot. The romantic relationships of the characters is another part of the subplot. But it's really these two guys in their lives for the roughly 15-year period. That's the way I would say it without spoiling it. It's kind of the ups and downs of them being in the publishing industry, of creating this character, and also the war and how that impacts them. Um, and it is, if I was going to recommend it to someone, Michael Chabon's writing is superb. He has like some of the strongest metaphors and similes in a book that I've ever read. He has a lot of detail in the book, and I think the more kind of familiar you are with comic book history, the easier it is to read. If you're someone who doesn't know about comic book conventions, some of this may seem strange. But I think he gives you enough to where you can follow it and it's not too overwhelming. There's a book he references several times, Seduction of the Innocent, I think is the famous book. I knew about this guy, know something about comic book history, but it's this book that this psychologist wrote in the 1950s, I believe, talking about how comic books lead to juvenile delinquency and all this stuff. But that's mentioned a few times in the book, so that's helpful to know. There's lawsuits and stuff in the book, and if you know anything about the history of comic book creators, especially this time, that's helpful to understand kind of the backdrop that all these that's happening during this time. I don't think it's like absolutely necessary, but it's helpful. Um, yeah, I mean he's just a wonderful writer. I think that the writing sentence to sentence is very very strong. I think there's some set pieces. One of them happens as Joseph is leaving the Czech Republic. That whole scene is great. There's a party that's great, and then there's a scene at the World's Fair that are really really good. Um, if I was to say that there was anything negative about the book, I think the book is really 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 strong in the first two thirds, and then there's a twist that happens about two thirds into the book, and I just felt myself caring less and less. I kind of felt like the pacing was off in the book, and that maybe the last third probably could have been condensed a little bit. And some of the characterization I felt was a little wobbly. You kind of get the sense throughout the book that one of the characters I found was much more interesting than the other character, and you could feel kind of Chabon trying to balance these two things. But I don't think he always gets there. The book kind of jumps back and forth with time a few places, and I found that to be in some instances helpful, in some instances a little confusing as to why the characters did certain things. And there's certain times in the book where um, I think Chabon uh, wants to be maybe more mysterious and make things not as explicit as it possibly could have been. And I think that some of those instances I was a little confused. There's also some things with like character motivation. One of the characters, I mentioned this before, seems to really want to be successful, and it's not clear to me why, what is driving him to feel this way, and what kind of the end goal of that is. And that character's psychology is not as well developed as I would have maybe liked it to be. And given the length of the book, I think there was time to do that. Um, there's a lot of going over characters' backstories as well, especially there's a point I was remember towards the last third where there's a major character, we start getting her backstory, and I'm like, I don't really know if I needed that. So there's some details where he there's a lot of details in the book that really make the world feel immersive and real, but there's a little bit I think he errs on the side of too much where as opposed to too little. And there's a lot of lists in the book where he'll start listing things, and you're like, maybe you could have scooched it back a little bit. And then I'm trying to think of anything else. I enjoyed the side characters. There's a side character named Deezy, who is the editor. I like that character a lot. I thought he was fun. He kind of goes through something of a metamorphosis throughout the book, and I thought that was good. Yeah, I think some of the plot details, you know, the plot details, some things I think are a little more uh, implicit that I would have liked. Some of them really should have been more explicit, and then there's a couple of times where they're more explicit that I would have liked. He could have made them implicit. So how much to reveal things and how clear that they should be to the audience. There was a little bit of confusion on my end when I was reading some things. I was like, I'm not quite sure why that happened or why that character did that thing. And then I thought the ending could have been stronger. It was just kind of a personal preference. It kind of ends in a strange place, and I wasn't quite sure. You know, it just felt like this thing is happening, and then it just ends. And I wasn't quite sure if that ending was emotionally deserved, if that makes sense. Again, I'm trying to stay away from spoilers, but those are my feelings on it. I really, really liked the first two thirds. And if you're someone who enjoys novels for the sake of writing and the beauty of the sentence and metaphors and similes, then you will like this book. If you're someone who abhors comic books and just the idea of comic books are just not your thing, or if you just really don't like sadness in your books, it's a book set during the Second World War, and there are deaths throughout the book of many many characters, and I found it to be quite sad. And part of that is the sadness of the two characters who are kind of in this permanent sadness. And I think Chabon kind of captures this feeling of one of the sections is called the Golden Age, and there are characters who are um, in on the outside they should be on like the top of the world and feeling great, and they're not. And it the way the characters are drawn, you understand why they don't feel great. And I just was really moved by his ability to do that. And there were many times throughout the book that I was really moved. And I think he wrote in a very emotionally impactful way. And I doff the cap to Chabon. I think he's a really talented writer, generationally talented writer, one of the few really important novelists that we have. And both this and Yiddish Policeman's Union, I recommend to just people who like reading novels, even if you can kind of set away aside some of the prejudices that you may have towards like, comic books in that art form, or in this case of Yiddish Policeman's Union, noir, which I think some people don't like crime fiction. And so I think his ability to just write and have these kind of ties to genres, I find to be really refreshing. He doesn't look down on genre. I think this is, I, in some ways, I think when I looked what genre would this be, I think it mostly would fall into historical fiction, um, which is probably the closest thing, which is probably accurate. Um, but yeah, if you haven't read it, I highly recommend it. I think it loses some steam in the last third, but otherwise, I think it's really powerful book, and I think it is a book that you can talk to people about. I think it's a good book club book, but because there's just a lot of different themes that are really heavy that he explores, I think very well. And yeah, uh, The Amazing Adventures of Cavalier and Clay by Michael Chabon. Next time, I'm going to read a sequel to a book that I've reviewed already. This is 2054, I believe, the sequel to 2034. And I hope to have that up in a week or two. If you have read The Amazing Adventures of Kavalier and Clay, please let me know. If there's anything that you think that is important, like I said, it is I didn't want to spoil it. I could have gone through a spoiler-free review. I could have gotten a spoiler-full review because it's just there's so much there about the book, but I didn't really want to. I think it is worth people checking out, and I didn't want to also have a spoiler video. Um, if you've got a chance to read this, I'm sure this is someone's favorite book. So please feel free to, if there's anything you want to add in the comments about things that you feel I missed. I'm sure I did. Like I said, it's a lot of book. Please feel free to leave those below. Please be respectful of spoilers, of course. But um, as always, I'll have my Twitter link below, my Twitter handle. So if you want to follow me there, you can. If you enjoyed this, please like the video, subscribe to the channel if you haven't already. And until next time, bye.